recording.
Go.
Okay. Well, I think tonight will be doubly blessed by the lesson because I think it has application to the Christians and the church today. And we'll have, instead of 2 discussion questions, we'll have 3. And it's not multiple choice for Paul to choose which question to answer. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to finish the discussion of the 5 main offerings that God provided to the Israelites while they were at Mount Sinai. Uh, we've already talked about the 5 offerings, but that was from the perspective of the lay person or the common person. When we talk about the 5 offerings this week, we're going to talk about them from the perspective of the priests. And we're going to focus on what instructions God gave to Moses for the priests to handle, distribute, and dispose of the offerings that were given to them in front of the brazen altar. Now, as a matter of overview, because we're going to talk about all 5 offerings again, but from a different perspective, I'm going to start with a quick review of what these offerings were. We've been discussing offerings, and we started with the 3 free will offerings, which were the burnt grain and fellowship offerings. And then we discussed in one lesson the purification offerings, which are also referred to as the sin offerings. And then last week we talked about the reparation or guilt offerings. Now, if you remember, the free will offerings were voluntary in the sense that lay members of the Israelite community were not required to make an offering for the purpose of making any kind of atonement for a sin or an impurity. This is something that they voluntarily did, basically just to be able to approach the Lord by approaching the tent of the meeting with their offering. The purification offerings were provided by God to reconcile God's people to God by establishing a series of offerings which symbolically cleanse the members of the Israelite community when they committed sins which defiled the tabernacle, especially when those sins were committed by the high priest, the Lord's name, the community, or the individual members of the community. If you remember, when we talked about the purification offerings or the sin offerings, they were separated into 2 groups. One group for the high priest and the Israelite community in its as an entirety. And then the other group, group 2, was for the leaders of the Israelite community, the elders and other leaders, or individual members of the community. Now, when the sins were committed by the high priest or they were committed by the whole nation as an aggregate, then this required the high priest to go into the tabernacle itself and cleanse both the holy place and the most holy place by sprinkling blood before the veil and on the horns of the golden altar that stood before the veil. The offering that was made was not made to necessarily be accepted by God in atonement for sin, but it was to purify the temple and the priest so that he could further service to God. This required the high priest to sacrifice a bull, spread the blood inside the tabernacle, and then the rest of it outside around the brazen altar. But the entire bull was then taken outside, except for the fatty tissues, were taken outside the Israelite camp about 2 miles away to a place to be cleansed. And then the bull was completely burned outside the camp. Now, since when they were committed by the leaders of the Israelite community or by individual members, well, then that it defiled them before the Lord, and the offering offered or allowed the offering to be anything from a male goat for the leaders to for the lay people all the way down to a grain offering. And the grain offering was one exception to the sacrifice of an animal. And these were for basically purification to purify them of sin. A lot of these sins were sins against the holy vessels, some of which we're going to talk about tonight. Other sins were anything that uh, defiled the Lord by representing an impurity on the part of the people. Then last week we talked about the guilt offerings, and they were provided by God when individual members of the Israelite community committed sins that violated their covenant relationship with God. And this emphasized that when something is set apart to God, it becomes holy, and it can be impure or defiled by being misused. Also, it also reflected that any property that belonged to any member of the Israelite community was deemed as belonging to God. So if you defrauded some other member of the community out of their property, or you embezzled their property, or you stole their property, or you found it and didn't reveal it to the true owner, that was considered to be a violation against God that required a sin or guilt offering to be made. These sins had to be reconciled with God, whether they were inadvertently or unconsciously or unknowingly committed. It's almost what we call in law strict liability. If there's a defilement of a holy vessel, if there's a defrauding of somebody else's property, um, you may a similar crime today may be if you purchase stolen property, it's still stolen. And even though it's in your hands, you believe that you purchased it legally and everything else, it's still stolen. And this would be the kind of thing where you have to go and make a guilt offering. What was unique about the guilt offerings is that it required restitution to be made, and then a confession to be given, and then the priest would announce or pronounce forgiveness for that sin. In this week's lesson, we're going to look at these 5 different type of offerings from the perspective of how the priests were told to handle these different offerings. Um, the emphasis that we'll see in this lesson is that God is holy, and how the priests were told to treat these sacrificial offerings reflected not only that they were holy because they're set apart, their offerings to God and set apart to God, but also it dealt with how they were these different offerings were to be handled by the priests. Which what kind of priest could keep what portion of what offering, and what portions could be distributed to other priests or to family members of the priest. It also talked about what was handled, how did you dispose of what was left over. And so the key words are these scriptures tonight really discussed how these offerings were handled, distributed, and disposed of by the priests. So those are the 3 key words. What we're going to see is, as we discuss these 5 offerings from the priest's perspective and how they handle, distribute, or dispose of these offerings, we're going to see that there's 2 new categories of offerings that are still like burnt and grain offerings, but they're 2 new categories that set up a special thing that the priests were required to do with some burnt offerings and with some grain offerings. And then it describes 3 different types of fellowship offerings: the praise, the vow, and the free will offerings. With that introduction, the main point that I want you to receive from this lesson is that as servants called out by God to represent God's chosen people, the priests were given special laws to teach and remind them of their continued dependence on God's favor and grace, the holiness of God's nature, and the importance of being faithful stewards of the high status and the blessings which they receive from God. So the message speaks to the priests. It speaks to God gave them a privileged status to represent the Israelite community, and they were called out for this purpose. God called upon Aaron and his descendants to be the priests. And these special laws were to teach them how to fulfill the responsibility of priests in a way that would be glorification to God and reflect God's holiness. So keep that in mind as we go through this outline. We're going to have a general overview of these special laws prescribing how the priests were to handle, distribute, and dispose of the offerings. We're going going to talk then about the on God's grace and favor. Then we're going to talk about the special laws pertaining to the pure, and then we're going to talk pertaining to the free will offerings, which reminded the Israelites and their priests of the necessity kept them honest as far as being.
Folks, I'm sorry. I don't know what the problem is, but Bob
Servants of
seems
God.
to be
Do
frozen
we have a
up.
problem?
Yeah, I think you're freezing up on us.
Oh no. Okay.
Just keep going, Bob. I don't know what else to do.
How much of you, Pastor? I think what I'll do is I'm going to disconnect and come back on.
Okay.
Bob, before you do that, Pastor, have everybody turn off their video and see if that clears up the bandwidth.
On for just a second. And okay, I'm going to go off for just a second and then come back on. Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I hear you, Bob.
I'm
turning off my video. Nelson speaking.
okay. We were going through a computer update today, and that may have created a problem. I left off with on page 4 of the outline talking about the different topics we're going to talk about, and we're going to have an overview of these special laws prescribing how the priests were to handle, distribute, and dispose of the offerings. And then we're going to talk about the laws pertaining to continual offerings, which reminded the priests of their ongoing dependence on God's grace and favor. Then we're going to talk about the special laws pertaining to the purification and reparation offerings, which reminded the priests of God's holiness, and the special laws pertaining to the free will offerings, which reminded the Israelites and their priests of the necessity to give God their praise and worship. So all of these special offerings are directed towards the priests, and they remind the priests of their status that was given to them by God and their ongoing need to turn to God, depending on God to give them grace and favor, and pertaining to recognizing or reminding the priests that what they were handling in terms of these offerings was property that was holy because it belonged to God. And then the free will offerings, reminding the priests and the people that they should give God praise and worship for all the blessings that he's given to the Israelites. We're going to have the discussion questions and then we'll conclude. Well, let's talk about the special laws prescribing how the priests were to handle, distribute, and dispose of the offerings. As I mentioned before, in Leviticus 6, verse 8 through Leviticus chapter 7, verse 38, the scriptures are directed towards the priests. And in some cases, there's an overflow that it also refers to the lay people in the Israelite community. These laws dictated how the priests were to handle, distribute, and dispose of the offerings. They provided instructions on how the priests were to touch and eat the offerings. They provided instructions on how the priests were to allocate or distribute portions of the sacrifices among themselves or with the laypersons making the offering. They provided instructions on how the priests were to dispose of or discard the remainder or leftovers of the offerings. Even what was left over was property or an offering that was belonged to God and had to be treated with holiness and reverence. The overriding principle with respect to all these laws was that once the offering was made it became the Lord's holy property and had to be treated both specially and with reverence. So that theme permeates this section of the Leviticus. Now, while the law set forth in Leviticus 1 through 6, verse 7 initially introduced these 5 major offerings and provided general instructions to the lay members of the community as to when and what would occasion making the offerings. What we're going to talk about tonight provides instructions for the priests when they dealt with these offerings. These scriptures describe these laws that were given to Moses that ruled on how the priests were to handle, distribute, and dispose of these sacrifices are called laws. It's from the Greek word Torah, T-O-R-A, which is from the verb to teach or instruct. The reason that most translations use the word law instead of instructions is because the sense of the translation is that these weren't just guidance. These were laws. They are requirements or commands imposed by God. And so you'll see in most translations that these are called the laws that were given to the priests on how to handle, distribute, and dispose this property. Now, the property itself, as I mentioned before, that was given by form of an offering was considered holy. And the priests who handled them not only had to treat the property as being holy, but they had to be ritually and ceremonially pure themselves. You could not have a defiled priest handling a holy property. These laws reflect the transition of property from being considered common. A person in the community would take an unblemished sheep from the flock. That's just common sheep. But when he took sheep into the tent of the meeting and offered that as a sacrifice, a transition took place. It was no longer common property, it was holy property because it was offered to God. When it became holy, certain ritual procedures had to be followed. And this is where we get the expression about rites of passage. Because when this transition from common property made so that an offering became holy property, then rites, special laws applied because of the passage or this transaction that took place. And so we're going to see in this discussion that sometimes the property became holy property and other times it became most holy. The difference being most holy property could only be given to God or used by the high priest or the male priest in Aaron's line, while holy property could go to priest members' families or in some cases to the lay people themselves. So now we're going to talk about this category of continual offerings, which reminded the priests of their ongoing dependence on God's grace and favor. We're going to start with the law of the continual burnt offering. Now, whenever we say burnt offering from our previous lessons, what does that signal? It means that the animal was burned on the brazen altar. The animal was completely consumed or burned up on the altar. And when we talk about the continual burnt offering, this is an offering that was made by the priests every single day, 2 times a day. There are 2 lambs. One was sacrificed in the morning as a burnt offering, and the other was sacrificed in the evening. They did this every day. And by sacrificing the lambs as burnt offerings, the priests acknowledged their need for atonement. And at the same time as an offering, they're asking and petitioning for the Lord's favor. So every single day, priests would take a lamb and sacrifice it and burn it on the altar. And this was repeated in the evening, and it continued and it continued and it. By presenting the lambs as burnt offerings in the morning and again in the evening, they also included their grain offering and drink offerings. And this all points towards the priest continuously seeking atonement from God in order to receive God's grace, blessings, and favor. So it wasn't a one-time deal where the God appointed the priest and they assumed that they kept God's favor. It was a reminder that they had to continually make sacrifices to receive God's favor. This and the brazen altar to give a pleasing aroma to God throughout the day and throughout the night. Now, throughout the day, the priest was active in adding to the burnt offering of the lamb that they sacrificed, the fat that was from the fellowship offering. And they also put additional fuel for the fire to consume the offerings. Now, every morning, one time a day, clear the ashes, brazen altar, and carry them outside the camp to be disposed of outside the camp. This area outside the camp had to be ceremoniously clean. Now, because both the brazen altar where the lamb was burnt and the ashes, which reflected the consumed lamb, which was holy, the priest performed the act of taking the ashes off the altar and placing them on the ground wearing their priestly outfits. They had to be holy and symbolically or ceremoniously pure as they handled God's holy sacrificed lamb. Once they removed it off the altar and placed it on the ground, then they had to remove their holy garments and get into common garments, because then they would leave the tent of the meeting and carry the outside the tent, which was not a holy area, dispose of the ashes. So you can see how the continual burnt offering reflected the holiness of God's property and the purity of the priest handling God's holy property. So there's these ceremonies, an effect of reminding priests that this offering that they made 2 times a day, every morning, they had to deal with it as holy property, even though it had been consumed by the fire, until they took it outside the camp. So this also required diligence and effort on the part of the priest, because they had to keep that fire going continuously, day and night. And anybody that's ever been camping trying to keep a campfire going knows that you have to tend to the fire or it goes out. And that would be something that the Lord would frown upon and perhaps withhold his grace. And so the priests had to be not only constantly reminded of their dependence on the Lord, but they had to be constantly faithful and diligent in performing their priestly services. Now, matched with this continual burnt offering was the continual grain offering. Now, if you remember, the regular grain offering was made, the priest would take and divide the grain offering that was offered by the lay member of the community. He would divide it into 2 parts. One part was called the memorial proportion, and that was the portion that had the oil and frankincense, and the priest would take that and put that on burnt altar for consumption with the lamb that was being offered as a burnt offering. This memorial portion was to remind the Lord, or to have the Lord remember the request that was made by the layperson making the grain offering. Now, the rest of the grain offering, if you remember from previous lessons, was considered as God's holy property, and it was allocated, consumed by Aaron and his sons. So when we have an offering that's consumed by Aaron and his sons, we're talking about consumed by the priests. It's a most holy property. Its use could be only restricted and his sons. Consecrated priests, they were symbolically considered to be holy people, and they could then consume God's holy property. And it only could be consumed in a holy place. So this grain offering would be usually in the form of cooked bread or whatever, but they had to eat it in the tent of the meeting. They couldn't take it with them outside the tent of the meeting and eat it, because it wasn't a holy place to consume it. So what we have here is a continual burnt offering, the lamb. We have a continual grain offering, and we have restrictions or specifications because of how to treat this, because it's considered holy property. And basically, as holiness maintained its character as holy while it was located in the tent of the meeting. Now, the continual grain offering on top of this is a offering that it's separate and apart from the regular offering we're talking about. The continual grain offering was only offered by, the scripture says, the anointed priest. Only the high priest would make a continual grain offering. Now, as soon as Aaron was consecrated as a priest, the services of offering a continual grain offering started, and it continued throughout the Israelite priesthood as long as the tabernacle and the temple existed. This grain offering was offered by the high priest 2 times a day. Half of it was offered with the burnt offering of the lamb in the morning. The other half was offered with the burnt offering of the lamb in the evening. And it was made on behalf of all the other priests. So the high priest was making this continual grain offering on behalf of all the other consecrated priests, and he was doing it along with the continuing burnt offering. Now, this, unlike the regular grain offering, which a portion was burned on the altar and the other portion went to the priest, this continual grain offering was completely consumed on the altar of fire. There wasn't a portion that was set aside to the priest. It was a grain offering to the Lord. It was most holy, and it was burnt on the altar with the burnt offering. This continuing grain offering reminded the priests that even though they had been anointed as priests and as special servants of God, they nevertheless needed the Lord and his blessings to be protected from the biggest sin that a priest could have, spiritual pride. So they made this offering to remind themselves that they were in service to the Lord, and they were making this offer to the Lord on behalf of all the priests. And we already know from what happened during the time of Christ with spiritual pride of a high priest. They were so prideful that they rejected our Lord. And so they obviously weren't getting the message of the continual grain offering that was provided in these special laws given to Moses. Now, there are special laws that apply to purification and reparation offerings, and these purification laws and reparation, special laws for reparations, reminded the Israelites and of God's holiness. And we're going to see how that works. For the purification offerings, recall that the regular purification offerings were made to purify the offerers from sin and impurity, but the sacrifice was considered as God's holy property. The special laws for the purification offerings recognized, again, this word, most holy status of the sacrifice. By this, what's meant is that the offering had to be slaughtered in a holy place next to the brazen altar in the tent of the meeting. And the special place for the sacrifice of the purification offering was on the north side of the brazen altar. The most holy status required the priest to handle the meat and the blood as holy property belonging to the Lord. After the fat had been removed and burned on the altar, the remaining meat had to be eaten in the courtyard, a holy place of the tent of the meeting, and the meat can only be eaten by the priest who offered the sacrifice or by the males in that priest's family. Again, restrictions that treated this property as holy, and it only could be consumed by those that were holy in service to the God with this particular sacrifice. Anyone who even touched the meat had to be holy. If anybody that was not holy, if it was a person that was not performing the sacrifice for the purification offering, or anybody else just touched the meat for any purpose, meat became impure, and it defied God's holiness in terms of the sacrifice. Now, the laws regarding the holiness of the meat and the blood also transferred over to the special requirements for the garments worn by the priest and the vessels used by the priest to handle and distribute the meat and the blood. Any garment worn by a priest that was handling a purification offering sacrifice, if they got splattered by the blood of that animal, that blood was holy. And the garment had God's holy blood on the garment. The garment had to be washed in a holy place. That means it had to be washed in the courtyard near where the tent of the meeting was located. Only after the garment had been washed could the garment be then taken outside the courtyard. There's this rite of passage that goes with this garment. As far as the pots that were used, if this sacrifice meat was boiled, if it was boiled in a metal or a regular bronze pot, well, it wouldn't be absorbed by the material of the pot, and the pot could be cleaned within the courtyard. But if they used a clay pot, then the blood would be symbolically put into the porous part of the pot. It would become part of the pot, and there's no way to clean that. So the pot had to be destroyed. So you can see how these laws and the special handling reflected the holiness of the entire sacrifice, including the blood and the vessels that were used to hold the blood. The purification offering was offered for the sin of the high priest or the congregation. Whenever that took place, if you remember the purification offerings, then none of the meat could be eaten by anybody. It was an offering purely to the Lord. And that offering, if you remember, the meat was then, after the purification offering is made, the meat was taken and burned outside because it wasn't an atonement sacrifice, it was a purification sacrifice. Okay, let's go to the reparation offerings and the special laws for those. Recall that the reparation offering provided a means for atonement of sinners who breached their covenant relationship with God and required them to make restitution and confess and ask for forgiveness. The earlier chapters in Leviticus established when a reparation offering was required, but these special laws in this part of Leviticus described how the sacrifice was to be handled. The reparation offering was considered most holy and had to be slaughtered in a holy place on the north side of the brazen altar. Its meat could only be eaten by the priests who are anointed as holy people and could only be eaten in the holy place. All of the fat of a sacrifice for reparation offering were presented to the Lord and burned on the altar, and the blood was thrown around the altar itself as opposed being sprinkled on the horns of the altar. The rest of the sacrifices were distributed as follows. The hide of the burnt offering went to the priest who offered the sacrifice. The cooked grain offering, if that was made as part of the reparations offering, it went to the priest who offered the offering. The uncooked grain offering or the raw flour was distributed equally to all the priests. So if it was cooked, it went to only the priest that was handling the offering. If it was uncooked, it went into the common storehouse of all the priests. These provisions were provided by God to provide for them, so that they didn't have to worry about where they're going to get their food or how they're going to sustain themselves. And it really enabled them to focus on their priestly duties of representing the people and leading them in worship and instruction. Okay, now we got one group left, and that's the fellowship offerings. These special laws or peace offerings were considered as holy offerings as opposed to most holy offerings. What does that tell you? It tells you that lay people can join in eating some of the offerings. Leviticus 7, verses 11 through 36, now breaks out these fellowship offerings into three subcategories, or three types of fellowship offerings: the praise offering, the vow offering, and the free will offering. Well, what is offering? Somebody asked the Lord, please heal my son who's sick. And the Lord heals the son. The person is so grateful and thankful for the Lord answering his prayer, he decides to make a offering of praise or thanksgiving to the Lord. Of these three types of offerings, praise, vow, and free will, the praise offering is considered the most valuable offering to the Lord. It's an offering of bread. It's a free will offering, so it's an offering of grain or bread. And when this praise offering is made, if you remember last time we talked about free will offerings, they could be cooked, they could be baked, they could be in kind of a hard tack that was covered with oil, all different types of ways of presenting the bread offering. Well, when the praise offering was given to the priest, all the different kinds of cooked breads were offered to the priest. Yeah, in fact, the offering had to include all these different kinds of offerings. And it was given to the priest who performed the animal sacrifice that went along with the free will praise offering. Now, the rest of the bread, after the priest got his portion, could be shared with the priest and the lay person. So it would be a fellowship meal of bread with the animal sacrifice that went with it, where they really have a communal fellowship in this kind of praise offering. Now, for the praise offering, fellowship offering, which involved both the layperson and the priest sharing the bread and also sharing the sacrificed animal, the meat of the animal had to be eaten all in the same day. If there was any left over after the first day, it had to be destroyed because it was impure. Now, the vow offering is the same type of thing, except when the person makes a vow, he's saying, Lord, if you grant me victory in this battle, I pledge or I vow on your name that I will make an offering to you. Well, it's not a vow that's made to bribe God or to entice God into doing something that God wouldn't otherwise want to do, but it was to put a stamp on the request that I am really seriously asking the God to do this for me, and if you bless me by doing it, I'm going to fulfill the vow by making an offering. And so this is the type of a vow offering where it's a praise or thanksgiving to the Lord in conjunction with the vow. The difference between a praise offering and a vow offering is the consumption of the meat. In a vow offering, you could consume the meat on the day that the offer is made and the next day, the second day. Only on the third day did the meat become impure. Lastly, we have the free will fellowship offering. These are just like we just studied before. They're voluntary. They're made without reference to a specific prayer request or a vow. They're really made in response to just saying to God, thank you for blessing me. Thank you for being a Lord that cares about me. Thank you for being the Lord that loves me. Any fellowship offering of meat for any reason became ritually impure or ceremonially unclean when it became in contact with something that was impure, unclean, or unhealthy. If you used a dirty dish to make the offering, it was impure. If it was unclean because it was touched by somebody that had a sickness or a woman that was in her cycle or anything like that, it made the offering impure and it had to be destroyed. Now, the portions of the fellowship meat offerings which were allocated to the priests and their families had two other special things that we see in Scripture. The meat offerings of these type of fellowship offerings, the portion that was allocated to the priest, because this is remember, the meat offerings were shared between the priest and the lay person making the offer. Well, the portion allocated to the priest included the breast of the animal, and how that was done is the priest would take this portion of the meat sacrifice and wave it. And so it's called a wave offering. It's just an offering of that portion of the meat in a fellowship offering that goes to the priest. Then the right thigh also a desired part of the animal that was sacrificed, that part that went to the priest was called the contribution offering. And so they're offered these parts that were the choice parts of the sacrifice. Remember, the fatty portion was burned on the altar, but these are the portions that went to the priest: the breast, the wave offering, and the thigh, the right thigh, which is the contribution offering. So now I don't expect you and I, if you 10 minutes from now, if you ask me to go back and try to put all these details together, you're going to say, I got lost a long time ago and I don't remember. But I went into the details to impress upon you that when the Israelites made an offering to God, their offering became holy. And when the priests performed their services, they were required to make offerings that remind them that what they were doing required them to depend upon God on a regular basis, daily basis, and that they all needed God's favor and blessings in order to perform their functions. And so this whole system of sacrifices and offerings were all ceremonically dictated by God to remind the people that God is holy. What you offer to God is holy. And if it's holy, it has to be treated very carefully and to respect God's holiness. And that this was done down to who gets what and how it's handled. And so if you remember that general picture, then the point is made with this lesson. There are 3 discussion questions that follow, and I think these discussion questions will help us take what's ritually part of the Old Testament and the ceremonies that were performed by this priesthood and the offerings made by the Israelites, and we'll bring it into a contemporary setting. So what I'm going to do is follow the procedure that we followed in the past, where I'll read the question. It's on page 14 and 15 of the outline, and then we'll open it up for discussion. His grace and blessings on a daily basis, and in giving due thanksgiving, praise, and recognition for everything which God does. Christians must treat God's word, his church, and his laws as holy and not allow them to be defiled. How Christians live their lives and handle what God has given them bears witness to the world of God's holiness, sovereignty, and purpose. Like the Israelites and the priests, Christians today must keep the fire of worship and holiness burning. Continual burnt offerings.
Amen.
Okay, I'm going to take the rest of the month off, Pastor. This one got me.
You
Hey,
did great.
this was a great lesson. I really liked what you said under B of lessons and applications. Christians must treat God's word, his church, and his laws as holy and not allow them to be defiled. That really sums up what we as the priesthood of believers need to be involved in day by day. And I appreciate the lesson, Bob. It was really inspiring to me. Challenging. I know you put a lot of work into it.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Bob.
this one
did great.
burned a few fuses.
Absolutely.